everybody, again. This is the session 6 on connecting worlds, self and identity travel narrative, and I'm very happy to present Juan Pimentel and Manuel Buron speaking on hidden or forbidden on female roles in South Pacific early contacts. So up to you. It's too bad that this session, it's a ghost session, which we are the only ones here. Very appropriate for travel. So, Manuel, please start immediately.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm going to share the...
Thank you, Sylvia. We are going to try to share the screen.
Okay.
There you are. Here we are. Well, thank you very much, Sylvia, and thank you, everybody. Of course, we have slightly changed the title just to not to lose the good traditions of normal conferences. Please shut the door. Well, the short stay of the expedition in Tahiti in April 1768 soon became famous in Europe. In just 10 days, the visitors bypassed coral reefs, suffered a couple of storms, and had several encounters with the natives. These were unequal encounters. Plenty of misunderstandings and performance. No? There was a place for everything, for mutual inspection, for violence and commerce, for intercourse in the double meaning, no? Exchange of objects and exchange of sexual relation as well. No? At the same time, the testimonies left by those navigators engender supplements, comments, essays, and fictional stories ranging from Diderot to Stevenson, and in fact a complete anthropological tradition going from Margaret Mead to Greg Denning and Salmon and Serge Sheshekov, to name just but a few. More than other Polynesians, the Tahitians seem to epitomize primitive happiness and blissful ignorance of private property. The customs and culture enjoy the benefits of bountiful nature. Enlightened cliches, one after another, were used to speak about these people without history. But if there was something that fired the imagination of the Europeans, it was the sexual customs, the polygamy the Tahitians practiced and which they invited the guests to share, offering the women scandalized, at the same time seduce Bougainville and his party, torn between offense and lust, between morality and the call of pleasure. The opinions and statements of Tahitians women obviously tell us more about the enlightened vision and about the women themselves, subjects of different interpretation in the South Pacific encounters. Here we will focus on the role of Tahitian women from a novel perspective, that of the taboo, collision between sacred and profane, the use of women as a weapon, talisman, or shield against a possible threat, and their role within codes of what is forbidden or acceptable. In addition, there is a happy incident usually ignored, or rather, usually reported as an unrelated anecdote. Traveling on the sea was the person considered to be the first woman to circumnavigate the globe, Jean Barret, disguised as a man, defying the laws of the French Navy and the history of exploration itself, as strictly male preserve. Partner and servant of the naturalist Philibert Commerson, Barret collected botanical samples around the globe, and transgressed one of the most deep-seated taboos in European navies, achieving classical Enlightenment feat, a voyage round about the Earth. To make matters worse, in Tahiti, of the hubs following her stay in Tahiti, her true identity was revealed. Apparently, the revelation involved the Tahitians, maybe the women, maybe Autourou, the native who embarked with Bougainville for France, where he eventually developed a taste for opera and the company of Madame de Chauchel. Well, this is a story, summing up, this is a story about rules and transgression, about hidden bodies and disguises, about taboo, women, and navigation. Our aim here is to highlight the simultaneity and symmetry of what is hidden and forbidden about women in both cultures.
The mares of the Pacific and its archipelagos open up a whole new scenario for the myths of the Enlightenment. Without doubt, the image the Europeans painted of its women were one of the main reasons for the success and wide diffusion of the voyages. Tahiti in particular became the place where all the debauchery and sensuality of the women of the Pacific were concentrated. This was the case for Bougainville, but also for William Blythe or James Cook. The latter even told his publisher, John Hawkesworth, how uncomfortable he felt about the most erotic part of his voyages. However, Hawkesworth knew perfectly well what he was doing and spared none of the details in his 1773 compilation, which met with considerable success. Diderot also took advantage of such encounter in his famous supplement to the Voyage of Bougainville, and so the name of the Otaheite and the fame of its women earned a place in literature. They appear, for example, in the memoirs of Chateaubriand, in the delusions of the Marquis de Sade, and in many adventure novels of the 19th century. However, despite the myths and the license, there is no doubt about the role of indigenous women in encounters with Europeans. All the narratives agree on the same point. Contrary to the Western tradition, women play an essential role in welcoming those strange beings from so far away. In delicate moments like this, the women did not hide. They did not expect privacy. Quite the contrary. They seemed to enjoy an uninhibited leading role. They let themselves in. They flaunted themselves. They haggled. They talked. They shout. Finally, they dance. To Western seafarers, this behavior was quite unbelievable. Iberian navigators in the 16th century had already recorded a reception in canoes with the active participation of women, a scene that could later be confirmed in the Enlightenment. Thus, for example, Vicente de Nápoles, who traveled to the Moluccas in 1527, remarked on one of his stopovers that among the natives who came on board, there was a woman who looked like sorceress, and who, I quote, tempted us with hands. Another case in 1595, Mendaña also recorded that in the Marquesas, Indian women were extremely beautiful and, I quote again, easy to engage with in good conversation. A year before Bougainville arrived, Wallis men confirmed it. One of them, Robertson, spoke of young girls performing tricks. Another man, Wilkinson, commented that the woman was directed by the men to stand in the prow of the canoes and expose their bodies naked to our view. Bougainville commented in a famous passage where he recounted how in the second meeting they were surrounded by canoes of women. who could rival and surpass European women in beauty. They were like naked nymphs, because the men and all women who accompanied them took off the veil that covered the girl. They made gestures ranging between innocence and voluptuousness, because even where the frankness of the golden age still reigns, certain women and girls appear not to want that which they desired most. One of those comments that will lead to a plenary session of sexism in the West. In the same passage, we will also include the episode of a Tahitian woman who once on board and dressed like being sorry before the Frisian shepherd. She had even had her fine shape. It was difficult to restrain those bewitched men, added Bougainville, who even acknowledged that it was difficult to control himself. The rituals in which women of the Pacific clearly played a leading role were the dances. Dances, contortions, lively movements, and obscene gestures. Women even exposed their genitals to the sight of the Europeans. Again, in the 16th century, Mendaya described this frenetic movement as threats, greediness, taken. This, on the other hand, spoke of gesture, of wanton tricks and wanton antics. Bougainville of teasing Joseph Banks and obscene postures and mouths contorted in the most ordinary way. Finally, Arcadio Pineda, one of the crew members of the Malaspina expedition, trying to capture the double sexual and military nature of those dances, described them as lubricious military dance. Well, an essential part of reception and celebration, the women of Tahiti were described with the clichés of antiquity and neoclassicism. Virgil, Ovid, Orlando Furioso, the paintings, Boucher or Watteau. The women of the Pacific seemed like Venus, ready to yield to love. Bougainville baptized Tahiti as New Cythera, the island of Aphrodite. Commerson, the naturalist of the expedition and partner of our heroine, also surrendered to the charms of the island. And I quote, "Perhaps the only one place on earth where men live without vices, without prejudices, without want, without dissent, born under the most beautiful sky, nourished by the fruits of soil which is fertile with cultivation, governed by family fathers rather than by kings. They know no other god than love. Each day is dedicated to her. The whole island is her temple. Every woman is her idol. Women worship her." It's invisible to see this role of women as a part of taboo. Taboo is the main indigenous contribution of the Pacific international heritage. Discovered by Cook, it was soon seen as the keystone underpinning the entire social life of those societies. Margaret Mead left a basic definition. Taboo can be defined as a negative sanction, a prohibition whose infraction without human or superhuman intervention results in an automatic penalty. Places where the natives did not enter, certain moments in which it was not vicious to carry out whatever action, unexpected offenses that cause excessive reactions. Even the death of Captain Cook, its discoverer was due to a mysterious taboo, as evidenced by the famous controversy between, for example, Ovid Sekeri and Marshall Islands. In fact, taboo was just one of the more visible consequences of a complex and variable religious and social combination. Explaining every ritual or procedure, every social phenomenon in Polynesia by resorting of taboo was like, for example, explaining the entire West through the idea of sin. To begin with, taboo represented one of the two sides of the problem. Its opposite was Noa. To the contrast between sacred and profane state, Tapua Noa was added the dichotomy between the pure and the contaminated, forming a kind of fundamental axis on which a good part of the social ritual order of the cultures of Polynesia seems to be based. This complex contrast between states was magical, governed by fluctuating energies, traditionally reduced to the concept of mana. It was also religious, being based on a series of myths that varied in intensity and form in different archipelagos and islands. And finally, it was labile, since it was possible and desirable to take action to mediate, avoid, or favor the transition between the two states. The universe was a huge game of opposites, where taboo was a sacred quality that could be infected and both to dance or it's important, to attack. The taboo of woman, along with that of food, was the first to attract attention of Europeans. In fact, women were not taboo, sacred, but on the contrary, trained, Noah. Man was made taboo, woman was left in a Noah state, just like the mouth for food, explained an early Maori source. This might lead one to think that women were simply considered impure. However, this is more complex. The women of the Pacific play an active role with action head displays in numerous rituals all along the Pacific, generally related to the elimination of taboo. In New Zealand, for example, it was common for women to first enter on the houses that has been built in order to desecrate them, to desecrate the space. In Tahiti, women were important in those rituals that represent Oro, the terrible god of war. For example, the Chronicle of Morenhout, a Belgian explorer and ethnologist, relates how woman's sexual act eliminate the French state of war. Wallis was surprised by the appearance of a canoe with an upper platform, as you can see, in which the women perform shocking acts of exhibition. Precisely, visibility and exposure seems to be fundamental elements in the rules for those moments of transgressions. And one of the most sacred and delicate moments for all the culture of the Pacific was that of meeting strangers. Finally, the magical power of the female sex in the South Pacific is clearly reflected in some of the most characteristic ritual objects of New Zealand Maori art, such as, for example, the tiki or the pare. Pare are a series of finely carved wooden lintels located in the entrance and exit areas of the whare, or traditional houses in New Zealand. Once again, as you can see, we can find a female figure who dominates the ritual act with a marked representation of the sexual organs, and who generally, as was the case with the rest of the canoes, appears surrounded by other male characters who seem to protect or accompany her. All the historians seem to agree that the function of these lintels was magical or religious. In this way, visitor or stranger who enter the house under the female sexual representation remain under the influence of the mana or magical force of ancestral or symbolic figure. The woman's function was to balance, eliminate, and transgress the taboo in the Pacific.
Well, therefore, women's role in certain oceanic rituals was defined by visibility, display, and agency, and not by concealment, seclusion, and passivity. While Europeans were shocked and seduced by women's behavior in Tahiti, their function within their own cultural codes was to eliminate or regulate the taboo, something of which the Europeans of the times were still unaware. As usually happened, it is even more difficult to recognize your own taboos. This is illustrated by the adventures of Jean Barret, the woman who disguised herself as Commerson's valet, as Commerson's servant, and who enable us to carry out these small comments, this small reflection of symmetrical anthropology on the roles of women in Polynesia Western culture. In contrast, the nakedness of those nymphs of Venuses, the first remarkable thing in Barret's story is precisely her clothing, her disguise, the concealment of her feminine attributes under a sailor's uniforms and bandages that cause her severe injuries. If the peoples of Polynesia offered enlightenment an example of primitive ingenuity and natural goodness, that is, authentic truth, Barret's story traced the hypocrisy and despotism of civilization. In other words, its disguise. If these encounters between barbarians and civilized people had something of charade and theatrical performance, as Greg Denning and many others have pointed out, it must be recognized that both sides overreacted. Both sides overplayed in their nudity and in their bulky clothes. That is, in what they exhibited and they concealed, respectively. Barret's story has been told many times, with more or less fictional elements, since we lack her own testimony. Barret, in fact, is mute as Friday, Robinson Crusoe's slave. She's left nothing in writing, although some suspect that many of the botanical descriptions and herbariums collected on the journey were her work and not Commerson's. Commerson had already employed her as a nanny and maid in his house in Burgundy when he was widowed in 1762. 2 years later, Rennes became owned by him. They both went to Paris, where she got rid of her son, so she could go with Commerson on his trip around the world with Bougainville. The rules of the French Navy prohibited women from embarking on these navigations, and it's very telling that once her identity was discovered after the stay at Tahiti, Commerson denied any knowledge of the deception, something completely unbelievable. They were coupled and shared a cabin for several years on one of the two ships of the expedition. Commerson formed what has been called, quite euphemistically, a creative or collaborative couple in the history of science. This is the case of the Hevelius family, for example, in astronomy, the Buckland family in paleontology, or the Lavoisier couple, the Lavoisier family in chemistry, couples in which the predictable division of labor worked. The woman collected data, ordered material, carried out field laboratory work, while the husband designed species, formulated theories, signed off the papers, and were appointed to academic posts. Due to Compton's precarious health through the trip, it was Barret who collected the hundred of specimens forming one of the largest botanical collections amassed by an individual at the time. This collection is preserved today in the Natural History Museum in Paris. And as far as we know, Barret was the first woman to perform a circumnavigation, a very peculiar enlightenment feat, even more masculine than the other enlightenments undertaken, circular and pedagogical too, the encyclopédie. She performed she formed it disguised as a man, no? Just as other women has had disguised themselves as pirates, soldiers, missionaries, and other masculine roles. It is difficult to read Bougainville and Commerson comments on the Tahitians without thinking of Barret. That advises, as we said, no, without prejudice, without want, without scent, those women dedicated to love, mm, with no obligation, as in the cliché of Eastern and Islamic women, devoted to leisure, free from all confinement, as Commerson dared to say. Um, Anyway, we go back to the revelation of Barrett's identity episode, considering what the history and anthropology of science call the principle of symmetry. No? Meaning an anthropology of ourselves in symmetry with the classical anthropology of others. There are several versions of what really happened, no? Who and how Barrett's sexual identity was revealed. Some said it was Roux, the Tahitian, who embarked with Bougainville on the way back to France. Some others pointed to a collective discovery by the Tahiti islanders. And finally, among the latter, some claim that they were the Tahiti women who discovered that Barrett was also female. Apparently, could smell her. Diderot subscribed to this theory since he defended the supremacy of the lower senses in primitive peoples. Several accounts mention that a rape either took place or was about to, either by the natives or by the sailors. Corner Barrett claimed that she was not a woman, but a eunuch, un eunuco. We have no time to comment on the eventful return from Mauritius, where she stayed for more than 5 years. Suffice is to say that when she returned to Paris, she was unable to complete the study of her collections, and yet the Navy, years later, granted her a life pension. There was also the furtive and encrypted tribute that Commerson paid her before he died, baptizing Nena, a botanical um, species with her name, Baretia bonafidea, an heterophyte phanerogam, a flowering plant with different leaves, with different shapes of the leaves. According to Commerson comment, a plant that the seeds with its dress or leaves, and which is named after the heroine who changed her feminine clothes and behavior into masculine, dare to travel the entire planet by land and sea with us. Armed like Diana and sharp like Nerva, Commerson ends, she miraculously escaped safe and sound from the snares and dangers of men and wild animals, not without putting her own life and honor at risk. She was the first of her sex to circumnavigate the world, leaving more than 15,000 leagues behind her. End of quote. Well, one last image to finish. Truth being villain, by reason of philosophy, ready to be adorned by imagination, surrounded by science and arts, history, poetry, mathematics, geometry, and below, technology, technology and the medical trades. This is the very famous frontispiece to the Encyclopédie Prévost engraved, no? An iconic image, as you know. It was made in 1772, a few years before Barrett went to France after her circumnavigation. Once again, we have the topic of the nuda vitas, no? The unveiling of the truth, that elusive goddess hidden down a well or wrapped in a veil, but in any case hidden. Seen from now, some may consider it a quite misogynistic picture, but let's imagine for a moment a change of character in this aletheia. Aletheia is the Greek word for unveiling, removing, disclosure. No? If that revealed truth were Jean Barret, the sciences and liberal arts might easily be the women of Tahiti, a group of half-naked women unveiling the truth. This is what exactly a symmetrical approach looks for, to show to what extent a foreign or external observation adopting another gender or another cultural perspective often reveal culture's convention hidden or invisible for its own members. Thank you very much.
Thank you.